everybody. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jessica Scarane. I am running to be the next Democratic senator and the first female senator from the state of Delaware. And I'm going live today to answer questions that anybody might have. As we have moved our campaign entirely online, this has become a really awesome tool to reach out. So I hope everybody's having an awesome Monday. Mondays aren't typically your favorite day, but I hope that you're able to start this week out on a good foot. I had a few things that I wanted to start with, just that I think one thing that's really important right now is to remember that it's okay to not feel okay every day. There's a lot of stuff that's going on that's pretty overwhelming, even if it's not directly affecting you or your family or your friends. The vibe is just bad, and there's so much news, and there's so much going on, and there's so much frustration around how things are being handled, and the kind of underlying fear of coronavirus and its effects on our lives and our livelihood. So I just want to say that it's okay to not feel great every day and to be, gentle with yourselves. I know that this weekend I found out that a family member of mine is in the hospital with coronavirus infection and in critical condition right now. So I think that that's definitely been weighing on me and something that I've felt the effects of. So I think it's just important to remember to take everything a day at a time and be okay with not being okay. Something else I wanted to start out by talking about is that this weekend quite a few employees of Bay Health reached out to me because they're not being allowed to work remotely right now, even though they have jobs that they believe can be done remotely. They believe that the infrastructure exists to do that work at home. They believe they have the ability to do it, but Bay Health is not allowing them to do so, and they're really concerned about their safety. They've filed OSHA complaints. They've contacted management and tried to have discussions about it. They've contacted the media and elected officials and really haven't gotten results yet. So we put a post up about that today on Facebook, and we're going to link to that in the comments here as well for you to read and share, because we really need to stand up for these workers and take care of each other. I mean, we know that there are people who are essential workers right now, and we thank them for doing that work. We are fighting and telling the story of how they deserve things like paid sick leave and higher wages and hazard pay. But there are also workers who are essential who can be doing their work from home in a more safe place. And that's what these Bay Health workers believe they are. And we have to stand up for them. So they are asking for us to help them stand up to protect their health, the health of patients in the hospital, the health of their families, and frankly, the infrastructure of our healthcare system. If people who are contributing to that infrastructure get sick, then it affects Bay Health's ability to deliver healthcare services. So we need to listen to them. So please check that out and share that, and do what you can to share their message as well. This week we got a few questions ahead of time. So I figured I would start by answering those questions, and then whoever's in the chat, if you have a question for us, I will try to answer it while we're here. So first question was around what to do if you're struggling through this right now, if you need housing assistance, unemployment assistance, food assistance. So we there's a resource guide that we have been contributing to, and we're going to post that in the chat as well, that has quite a bit of information about what you can do if you're struggling right now with any of those key things: housing, unemployment, food. If it doesn't have something that you need and you're looking for, please just reach out and send us a message. That guide has been growing, and it's a living document. So as we find more resources, we can keep contributing to it. And we have tried to do that individual work for people who need help too. So we are always happy to do that. There's also a Facebook group that you can join, specifically if you're from Delaware, called The Helpers Delaware, where there's been a lot of people sharing about what they need or about the service or help that they can give. So it's a really great place to go get any immediate needs or questions addressed by people who are looking to help. So those two resources are available right now, and like I said, we'll share links to them. Let's see, anything else? All right. So another question was about what is in the CARES Act or the stimulus bill that we've been hearing quite a bit about. So I know this is kind of complicated. There's been quite a few pieces of legislation that have been put forward. So first was expanding medical leave. So there was an expansion to family and medical leave to account for people who might need to take off because they're either sick or because they're caring for people who are sick. But that is the one that applies to companies that have fewer than 500 employees. And what it does is that you get 12 weeks that are protected from like leave. So you can be off for 12 weeks and it includes 10 weeks of paid leave. And that it only applies for this year. It's really about responding to this crisis right now. And then the next piece is adding paid sick leave. So this again also applies to companies that have fewer than 500 employees, as well as any public employees. And those employees are provided with paid sick leave. But it is only if you are sick because of coronavirus or COVID-19. So you can take advantage of that paid leave for 10 days or I guess 80 hours, depending on how your work schedule works. But it only applies if you are required to quarantine, you have a doctor's order, you have symptoms, or you're caring for an individual who is sick or has symptoms. So there's additional paid leave there. There's also additional unemployment payments. So in addition to what you might get from the state in your unemployment benefits, there's an additional $600 that you can qualify for through unemployment. I have heard that getting unemployment right now is a real challenge. A lot of people are trying to use the website and it crashes, and this is happening across a lot of different states. I know that people are trying to make phone calls and they're unable to get through. So recognize that is still a struggle right now, but the only advice that we really can give is to keep trying, because it is important that you file for those benefits so that you can receive replacement for your wages that you may have lost. All right, what else is in the bill? So other pieces in the bill, a lot of people have probably heard about the $1,200 payment. So there is a $1,200 up to $1,200 payment that people can receive if you made under $75,000 in 2018 or 2019. If you've already filed your 2019 taxes, they'll use 2019. If you made under $75,000, you will receive $1,200 if you're a single individual. If you made more than $75,000, it'll begin to phase out and you'll get less and less up to, I believe it's $99,000. So that check is still kind of limited in who has access to it. So if, for example, you're a college student and your parents claim you as a dependent, you would not receive a check. If you were, again, if you make more than that limit, you get a smaller check. And if you have a child, you will receive a $500 check, calling it a check, deposit for the children that you have that you claim as dependents. But we know that really doesn't go far enough. And there's people, like we said, there's people who aren't going to receive that money. Other pieces included is that testing for coronavirus is free. However, treatment is not. So if you don't have insurance, you could be charged tens of thousands of dollars for the treatment if you get sick. If you do have insurance, you're still going to have to meet a deductible or make any payments that your insurance company requires, unless that insurance company has agreed to cover treatment, which I know, at least for the plan that I'm on right now through Highmark, they've agreed to cover the cost of treatment. So that's another thing that you should definitely look at. If you have insurance, follow up with your insurance company to understand what it is that they are, how they're handling coronavirus. All right, any other questions? One note about the deposits and checks as well for that $1,200. The plan is that if you have a bank account set up with the IRS, they will deposit it into that bank account in the next few weeks. If you don't have a bank account set up, if you don't get a direct deposit from your tax return or something like that, they're going to have to track you down, and they've been saying it's going to take longer for them to deliver those checks. So they aren't coming as immediately as I think everyone had hoped. Yeah, so Debbie's asking about freelancers and the self-employed. And she made a note that Secretary of Labor Cade said that last week they're not being implemented on the state level, and like to know when I should apply. That's a really good point. So I actually have a friend who's in this situation as well, who was a freelancer or contractor, and she was laid off. And while she doesn't qualify for state benefits right now, she should qualify for the federal money. However, she tried to file through the state and was denied. So I think right now that's something we should probably look into and try to figure out, because it's unclear on how you actually are able to get the federal dollars, even if you aren't qualified for state dollars. So I think that's something we can definitely follow up on and keep an eye on to figure out what the proper process is for people who should be getting the additional unemployment money from the federal government, even if they aren't qualified for the state, because the federal unemployment dollars applied to part-time workers, gig workers, freelancers, self-employed. Everybody who typically does get cut out of unemployment should be able to get federal money, but it's unclear at this point how you apply. So that's something we can definitely follow up on and try to get more info for Debbie and anybody else that applies to. All right. Joe asked a question or made a point about that we heard about 2 more corrections officers in prisons in our state that have tested positive for coronavirus today. How could we help? What could we do? What thoughts do we have? So that is something that we, as a campaign, have been trying to push on as well, is that both ourselves, we've been pushing for it, and then the ACLU and their Smart Justice initiative has also been pushing for change here. So one of the things that you can do if you are concerned about the incarcerated population in our state is that you can reach out to your elected officials and to the governor to push on them to decarcerate. So what we're recommending is that what people who are deemed low level offenders, people who are maybe a high risk population for illness, people who are close to their sentence being over, there's a lot of parameters that are in place. We're asking the state to decarcerate them, to release them, because we know that if the prisons are crowded, it's going to be a lot harder to contain a viral outbreak. And we believe, as well as ACLU and a lot of other states have already taken action on this, that we can keep people safer, both people who work in the prison as well as people who are incarcerated, if we have fewer people in the prisons. So that's the biggest thing right now that you can do to take action on this. We haven't heard anything about prisoners testing positive. The line has been that no prisoners have tested positive, but we haven't heard any information about how many prisoners have been tested. But we do know that I think they're up to 6 or so correctional officers who have tested positive. So we know that the virus is in these correctional facilities, and we really need to take steps to try to prevent it from becoming a really dangerous outbreak that leaves people unable to fend it off. I mean, it's really hard to socially distance when you're imprisoned, and that's the biggest concern, is people are living and sleeping in close quarters in prisons typically. So how do we make sure that we keep people safe there as well? All right. All right, so Valerie has a question that she is labeling kind of grim. How do we even attempt reforming a party so craven and desperate that it manipulates its own primary vote totals and works with Republicans for suppressive edge against left-wing encroachment? Yeah, this is a really frustrating position we're in, right? That we're trying to work within a party and a system that feels like it's working against us a lot of times. And we are trying to use the structures that are in place to push things in the direction that aligns with our values and our beliefs. I think that one of the best ways to do it is to do what our campaign and a lot of campaigns are trying to do right now, and that is running on building true grassroots support, that the goal of that support is not just to get people elected, it's to actually change the conversation. And that's why a lot of what we do with our campaign is to try to call people to action. Because I think without the demands from people on the ground and from the people who are living with the decisions that are made by our elected officials right now, we're not going to see change. It has to be people taking action and getting re-engaged with this system. And I know that is a tough ask, because I know that people are forced to work 2 and 3 jobs and sometimes 7 days a week, and they don't have the energy to be engaged with every single vote that their elected official is taking, or every single appearance that they're making on TV, or speech that they're making to get someone else elected. But I think that we have to find a way to sort of break both of those issues down together, because that engagement is going to be so important, and I don't think we get anywhere without it. I don't think it can just be getting individuals elected. It has to be this groundswell. I think that we really need to get people, I do think we have to get people elected who are committed to legislating in favor of people, and who are not going to have their main goal be making a bipartisan compromise when they get in the room with the other side of the aisle, and the people who aren't in the room are the people who that legislation actually affects. And I think that is what people are most frustrated by. When we hear that Congress doesn't work, or the Congress has the lowest approval rating, people would rather get a root canal. I think what we should really think about is what they're saying. It's not that, I don't think what people are asking for is for both sides of the aisle to do a better job of taking away their rights and making their life worse. What they actually mean is that Congress is ineffective at delivering material change for their life that makes it better. And that's the thing I think we have to be oriented toward and really focusing on. And right now, I think we like working within the Democratic Party is important, because I believe that the Democratic Party can be better. And I think that's what we're asking for, is better and a commitment to the people, and a swing back away from the corporate dollars that have bred corruption within the party and the government as a whole, and change the focus of our government. William Wood asked a question about how we're going to keep people, and I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, William, so if you want to add on... Oh, never mind. I see you fixed it. So you said, how are we going to keep people fed and housed for the upcoming weeks and months of economic effects from Corona? It's an incredibly good question. I have particularly been focusing on the housing aspect of that. I really believe that we need to completely put a moratorium on rent and mortgage payments for this period. We know that people are not able to make money right now because the government has said we are shutting down these businesses. That's the right decision. I'm not criticizing that decision, but what you can't do is tell someone that they can't make money and then ask them to also pay their rent or pay their mortgage. So what we need to do is that the governor needs to use the power that he has under the state of emergency to put out an executive order. The powers that the governor is given within a state of emergency allow him to use executive orders that need to be respected as if they're law during the state of emergency. So he could, for example, alter the tenant obligations of our state code for the duration of this state emergency that basically says rent is 0 for these 3 months, 4 months, whatever that timing is. Because yes, we have said people can't be evicted during this time, but that doesn't mean that rent isn't due. rent is still due. So once the state of emergency is over, if you've been unable to pay this entire time, then you only have 30 days to catch up, and then your landlord can evict you again. And 30 days is not going to be enough time for someone to find a job if they're not able to get back to their original job and make that money for 3 months of rent that they weren't going to be able to pay. When that stimulus check comes, maybe they'll be able to pay some of their rent, but they're also, if they're going to have other bills, and it's not going to be enough to sustain people for that entire time. I think that we need to be focused on ensuring that a public health crisis doesn't turn into a financial crisis and a housing crisis and a food crisis for so many people. So I do believe that our governor should be taking action to make sure that people are not required to pay rent or mortgages during this period. There was an expansion of SNAP benefits in our state. So people who qualify for those benefits actually have more money each month that they are receiving. So that's a good step in the right direction. I'd like to see more of that, and recognizing too that there are people who maybe weren't getting food assistance that need it now. How do we make sure that we get those people into the program? I believe that we should be doing better outreach around these programs, and I believe that I believe our primary focus should be ensuring that people are healthy, housed, and fed, because that is what's going to make sure that people survive through this, particularly when we've taken away their ability to make money during this crisis. So Luke asked about bringing in moderate Dems to pass progressive legislation that they currently oppose. I think this is twofold. So one of the things that I think is incredibly important is getting money out of politics. I think that we have to be fighting against that and calling it out at all times, because a lot of the reason that people are against certain legislation is because of the people who are funding their campaigns. So we have to be working on that fight while we are also trying to pass more progressive legislation. I think those things really go hand in hand. I think the other piece touches back on what I was talking about before about involvement from people. There are a lot of people in elected office who don't necessarily take the initiative to lead ahead of where public opinion seems to be. And I think that what they need to see is a true groundswell. And I do think when it comes to something like Medicare for All, we're starting to see that. And I think we have to keep pushing on that. And that engagement is what's going to make the difference for some people who are maybe fearful or hesitant to lead on an issue before their voter base is there, for fear of losing that seat. And I criticize that in some ways. I don't think that your goal when you're holding elected office is to try to continue to hold on to that seat as long as possible. I really think your focus should be more about what can you accomplish and what can you do with the power that you hold with that seat, and how do you do the best good with that power and the most good with that power. And if that still doesn't necessarily work, then I think we have to work on electing people who share those values and share those goals and are going to push in that direction. I don't think that we have to accept the systems we have and the people that we have within those systems. I think we can band together and fight to get better people in those seats if the person who's there now is failing their constituents. He says you're the best, but I think he must be talking to the team. And talking about people taking care of each other. And I think that's a really good point from Stephen. Like, I think that, I don't know, sometimes people really divorce themselves from the idea of politics. Like when you're canvassing, you'll hear someone, they're like, I don't really get involved in politics. And I think it's important to remind people that like politics gets involved in their lives, and that you can either be a part of shaping that and being oriented toward creating justice in the world and taking care of the people around you and building our collective power, or it's going to affect your life in a way that maybe is not what you want. And I think we've seen our country move further and further right, and we've seen the Democratic Party move along with it, and we've seen the middle no longer be what the middle was 20, 30 years ago. Like if you were in the middle 20, 30 years ago and you looked up today, you've been pulled much further right. And I think that it's important for people to be engaged for that reason, because without establishing clear values and knowing what we believe in, and believing that our government should exist to create a dignified standard for living for people, to care for people, and to provide for their welfare and their most basic needs. If you don't constantly remain oriented to that, then that's when you look up and you get kind of pulled away from it. And I think that it is really about people taking care of each other. It's about using our shared resources to ensure that everyone has what they need. Dash asks about supporting lifting sanctions on Iran to help fight against COVID-19. Short answer, yes, I absolutely support that. There are people dying in Iran because there are sanctions that our country has placed on theirs that, though humanitarian aid is technically allowed through, most people don't even take the risk of sending anything because they are fearful of being hit with a sanction violation. So yes, we absolutely should be lifting those sanctions. Charles asked about supporting eliminating the filibuster, and yes, I do support eliminating the filibuster. I think that we have to recognize that the filibuster will only be used to hamstring progressive policy, and I don't understand why we would hold ourselves to a standard that the current Senate leadership is not. And it's something that I definitely disagree with Senator Coons on. He would be in favor of keeping the filibuster in place, and I would eliminate it. Yeah, William makes a really great point about ending homelessness in the U.S. will cost less than just the increase in our military budget from last year. Something I sometimes say to people is that poverty and homelessness, they're a choice, but they're a choice that the people in power have made. They're not a choice that the people who are experiencing poverty and homelessness have made. It's entirely about the fact that we have refused to take action to end these things. The cost, as William pointed out, to end homelessness is small compared to what we spend on just increasing our military budget every year. And instead, we have people in power who have accepted poverty, have accepted the fact that just in our state, thousands of people sleep without a roof over their head. I mean, we had 4 people die this winter trying to keep warm while they were living in a tent. And that happened a few days apart from our government giving millions of dollars to Amazon to set up a facility in our state. That's the type of prioritization and priorities in general that I point to when I say that we are focusing on the wrong things. Anthony Clark is talking about judges. So he says, unfortunate that Chris Coons voted to confirm horrible judges. What should we do about the Supreme Court? So I'm of the mind that there are 2 illegitimate justices on the Supreme Court right now. I think that we should not be fearful of calling that out. I think that we should not be fearful about talking about how we remedy that. Supreme Court justices can be impeached. Supreme Court justices can be added. I think that we are at a place where what has happened to the judiciary is something we should be fearful of. The right has decided to use the judicial system as a country as a way to circumvent Congress, and has created a no longer co-equal branch of the government. And I think that it's really important to be honest about that and to call it out and to say that we have to fix this. When we Anthony is referencing the fact that Senator Coons has voted to confirm dozens of Trump appointees. And these are judges who are they're ideologically extreme. They are much younger than the average justice, which means that they will, judge, which means they will, frankly, be on the court for the rest of my life if they wanted to keep that seat. So they have the power to completely change the face of our country for the rest of my life. I think my standards would be clear on a few things. Clear on civil rights. We are talking about judges who have bad records on civil rights that Senator Coons has voted to confirm. Women's rights. We have judges who don't believe that Roe v. Wade should be the law of the land, don't believe that women have the sole decision-making power over their own bodies. These are judges he's voted to confirm. In fact, one such judge, Kurt Engelhardt, is the judge who is responsible for both kicking abortion cases back to the Supreme Court and kicking Affordable Care Act, Obamacare cases back to the Supreme Court. That's just one judge that Coons has voted for who's trying to dismantle structures that we have in place and that we believe in and that align with our democratic values. So those are two key things. And I think the third would be very much about Brown versus Board of Education. There are judges who have been confirmed who won't affirm that that was the right ruling. I think that is particularly troubling for a state like Delaware, where we know that we have segregated schools. I think that those are the three things that I would particularly be focused on, and understanding the belief of a judge's willingness to uphold precedent. And I think there's a lot of judges who have been recently confirmed who refuse to confirm precedent. So Kevin asked what we think we could do to help lower carbon emissions with upcoming COVID stimulus legislation. I think that's an incredibly good question. I think we should look at this situation as an opportunity to really remake our economy and the way that, and our social safety net. What I would like to see is putting forth what people are calling a green stimulus. So we just saw that the EPA is relaxing regulations, or at least enforcement of regulations. They're basically saying, due to coronavirus, we can't enforce any of the regulations that we put on polluters. So the EPA is using this as an excuse to allow corporations to poison us. So why aren't we using it as an excuse to say we need to put ourselves in a position that we can better handle climate change? Because coronavirus is not completely disconnected from climate change. It's a harbinger of what will come. We know that climate change will lead to more public health issues. It will lead to more pandemics. So this is frankly, a trial run of what might happen if we don't get climate change under control. So what we could be doing is saying, yes, we're not going to maybe put people to work right exactly now with social distancing rules in place, but we could be saying we are going to put the infrastructure plans in place so that once people are able to get back to work, these are the jobs that are ready. Re-outfitting buildings and retrofitting so that they are more energy efficient, as well as able to sustain the effects of climate change that we know are coming. We could be investing in public housing, green and energy efficient public housing to address some of the problems that people were bringing up earlier with the fact that we lack affordable housing in our country. We could be investing in public transportation so that we don't have such a reliance on cars and the highway system. Like, the highway system was an example of a infrastructure project that we chose to invest in and put people to work creating it. We can be doing something similar when it comes to public transportation. So I think this is an opportunity to actually even start rolling out a federal jobs guarantee that says if you are unable to find a job elsewhere or you want to work for the federal government, here's your opportunity, and we are going to put you in place, remaking our infrastructure and our economy so that it is stabilized and fortified against climate change. And just want to call out, Dan made a point that Food Not Bombs is based in Wilmington, Delaware, and they're trying to help people keep people fed during this pandemic. So that's another good organization to reach out to if you want to help people right now. Same thing with the food bank. I know I haven't necessarily been able to volunteer, but I definitely made a donation to the food bank so that they can keep people fed right now. So Michael's talking about public financing for political campaigns and a little more detail around that. So I think I kind of mentioned before, like getting money out of politics. There's so many levels to that. Like right now, money is in politics in quite a few ways, but public financing of elections is one key part of that. So instead, what would it look like? It would look like, instead of each individual campaign needing to raise its own money from either corporate PACs or super PACs or very wealthy donors or from small individual donors, which is basically the tools that people have right now, and we are only focused on one of those things, small individual donors. Instead, there would be public money made available to everyone who is running for office that will fund their campaigns, and that is all that funds a campaign. It takes away this outside influence of the millions and millions of dollars that get pumped into the system now that frankly create unfair circumstances for people who have access to that money as compared to someone who doesn't. So instead, it would create sort of equity within that system so that you are actually running on your policy and your platform and not necessarily how much money you can get to paper the town with advertising. And that some other tools that I exist are that I'm trying to think, I think maybe Washington did this. I'm not exactly sure, but one of those kind of West states created a program where individuals are also given a sum of money that they can contribute to campaigns. So still giving that way to create grassroots support and get people involved, but having it be actual people, not money that's funneled from corporations or super PACs. So that would look like, let's call it $100 everybody gets that they're able to dole out to the campaigns that they want to support as a way to still show grassroots support and build a movement and organize people that way. Sorry, I'm trying to read Terry's question right now. Individually or something else. The stream that way. They're working with us. Okay. I think, how can we individually be brave enough to support paradigm shift and take fear and money out of That's a good question, and I think that it depends on definitely who you're talking to and how you talk about it, because I don't think you have to convince a lot of people that what we have isn't working. If someone is working 2 jobs and still struggling to get by, if someone can't pay their bills at the end of the month, every month, if somebody wants to go to college but sees no way to do that affordably, if somebody recognizes that every single one of their grandkids has asthma and that no one in their family's ever had asthma before, people see the problems because people are the ones who live the problems. So I don't think you necessarily have to convince people that something should change. I think the work that, and this is based on a lot of the conversations I've had, is I think it's our job to remind people that they have power, especially when we all come together to use it. Because I think a lot of the conversation I like to have with people is that this isn't just like elect me and we get these things, right? It's much more about elect me and fight with me, and let's build our power together. Let's create a conversation that isn't just send someone to Washington and don't hear from them for 4 to 6 years, and then maybe look at their record when they come around again in 6 years and see if it was kind of up to snuff. It's much more about like being an interactive like sport. I don't like to call it a sport, but I think it's much more about like people staying engaged, because what I believe is that our government has to be both by the people and for the people. And the by the people part really has to be about staying connected to the people that decisions affect. And that's kind of like what I was talking about before, where if we continue to let the people who are currently in the Senate, who on average have a net worth well over $1 million and don't necessarily have the same perspective of what life is like for most people, continue to just get behind closed doors and make the decisions for us, like, we aren't going to get the change that we need to see. So I think it's about calling people to action and showing them where to put that energy. Like, people are there are a lot of people who are a range of emotions, right? Some people have despair, some people have fear, some people have rage right now, some people don't quite know what to do. But if we can focus people's energy and say, this is what we should be doing, and it's coming together and agreeing that our government should work for us, and the beliefs that we have around how it works for us is by guaranteeing us healthcare and guaranteeing us housing and guaranteeing us the basic needs that we have to survive so that we can live a good life, then I think that's when we start to get change, because we'll have people focused on the right goals and the same goals. And yes, it is like paradigm shift and it's changing structures, but like if you're fearful that that will turn someone off, I don't think that's how you have to have the conversation with them. I think you can say to them, like, right now our country works incredibly well for people who are already powerful and already wealthy, and not so much for the rest of us. And we know that's a problem. And that's the key thing we should be fighting back against. And then we can start to talk about some of the tools that we use to do that. Like, I think a lot about I don't think you have to convince people that their life shouldn't be so hard, or that their life should be entirely dedicated to working 7 days a week. And what it takes instead is finding the right way to focus that energy. And I think that's what a lot of more productive campaigns and issue campaigns and policy is really focused on, is getting people to say, let's focus our energy. And whether, some days my energy is rage and some days my energy is, hopefulness. But if we can focus that energy and remind ourselves of like that we're fighting for ourselves, I think that's when you start to get that shift. Because it's not going to be an easy fight. And I think you do have to keep reminding people who we're doing it for, and that we're doing it for ourselves, and that it only changes when we all stand together. Because money in politics, like the people who have bought their way into influence in our government, are not going to give that up easily. So it's not going to be, people aren't just going to lie down and let us change things. It's going to be a fight. And I think we have to be prepared for that and be okay with it. But we can do it. And I think that that's what we have to keep reminding people, is like, things can be better. We don't have to keep, we don't have to have the blinders or we don't have to have the limitations of the way things currently are. We don't have to keep working within these same structures. We can completely change them. And we're more than capable of doing that. And I think that's what people like almost have to be reminded of. When we talk about a stimulus, we don't have to think about, okay, what are the ways that we've done stimulus before? Okay, we've means tested it and we've delivered it through the IRS and whatever. We can try to do that again. We don't have to do any of those things. We could put a direct stimulus in place that just sends money to every single person every single month until we don't need that stimulus anymore, or until that becomes the norm. All of these things are possible. I think we just have to keep reminding ourselves that we don't have to be handcuffed by the existing structures that are in place. coronavirus and primaries, comments on states that held primaries and the infections we're seeing. Yeah, I think, oh God, all the days are kind of running together. I think we have seen a difference in infection rates in even, I think, like Illinois and Florida as compared to Ohio. I saw something about that today, that like Ohio is actually like trailing behind them. And some people were trying to talk about whether that was because people went and voted in Illinois and Florida and didn't in Ohio. I think that right now Wisconsin is going through this, where their governor said we're not voting, and I believe just before I got on their state Supreme Court overturned that ruling. So I think, again, people are unsure of what's even going on. I believe that anything that makes someone fearful of voting is frankly voter suppression, and sometimes that's intimidation, sometimes that's ID laws, and sometimes that's, am I going to get a illness that can kill me? And I think the last thing that we should be doing is anything that causes someone to second guess voting or choosing to stay home because they're fearful of what might happen if they go. So I recognize that for the states that are voting in March and now in early April, it's hard to try to figure out what to do in that situation. I'm glad to see that Delaware decided to move its primary date back to from April 28th, which is what it was. This is our presidential primary. It's moved to June 2nd. And we have allowed people to use coronavirus as a reason to request an absentee ballot. I think that is at the bare minimum what states should be doing. I would much rather see moving to mail-in voting and every single person gets sent a ballot and has the ability to send it back. But I understand that some states are not in a position to institute that in such a short period, but I think that's what we should be working toward. I think for every election that is happening later this year, that's absolutely what we should be working toward. We know mail-in voting works incredibly well in the states where it's already instituted, and they see higher rates of participation as well, which is what our goal should be. We should be working toward 100% participation in our elections. Mail-in voting is one of the tools that gets you there, and it also keeps people safe during a pandemic. Sorry, scrolling here. What are some immediate actions we can do to help counter influence of corporate media? They've even bought up most local news stations, and how can we get messaging out on good policy when they're running interference? That part that William says, particularly about buying up local news stations, is incredibly important. I think that is something that's happened sort of behind the scenes, where people haven't necessarily recognized that all of this consolidation has happened, even on the local level, where there are very few broadcasting companies that own basically all of our local news stations in our country now. So again, what happens there is that one sort of mega corporation is influencing the news and what gets reported on and the way that story gets reported and the lenses through which you see that story for almost the entire country. This is really timely because it's definitely a conversation that I've been having just with myself and with friends, of like, when you see a narrative take hold, it can be frustrating because you're like, why is everyone suddenly talking about this in the exact same way? I think that skill, at least, is something we should be trying to develop in people. That ability to sort of be, I don't want to call it skepticism, but I do want to say like that sort of like critical thinking around what are you seeing and who's telling the story. Because I think that's what's really important, is that who's the person who's telling that story can certainly influence the way the story gets told. And I think that, we've learned that lesson through history. And I think we see it now with the fact that very few companies control the majority of the news that we see. They make decisions even around, who the jobs that get to exist. I mean, right now, our local paper here in Delaware is owned by Gannett, and Gannett is furloughing and laying tons of people off right now. So in the midst of this health crisis, when like clear, honest reporting is so important to keep people safe, we are losing the reporters who do that work. I think this is one I don't have an answer on, but I think it's important that we keep talking about it, because things like media consolidation affect our ability to make sure that the most important stories get told. And I think we have to constantly be reminding ourselves that we aren't necessarily hearing from all sides of something. Kind of going back to what I was saying about when decisions are made behind the closed doors with people from both sides of the aisle of the Senate, there's still a lot of voices that are excluded from that conversation. And I think the same thing can tend to happen in the media. And I think it is something we really have to figure out, because I think that we've seen how from 2016 on, Donald Trump has been incredibly good at capturing that narrative. And right now he's running a press conference every day where it's just piped directly into people's homes. And, a lot of what he's saying is complete nonsense. A lot of what he's saying is harmful to people, but it doesn't necessarily get that, the commentary alongside of it that is necessary. And I think I am fearful, even going into this presidential election, about our ability and Democrats' ability to own that narrative themselves, and to get out in front of that, and to message what we believe and our vision for the country. I think we saw that happen even with the stimulus bill. I think a lot of the conversation was like, this is great. I believe Senator Coons used the word remarkable about when we're talking about getting people a $1,200 payment. I think the conversation should actually be, this doesn't go far enough. This isn't enough. Let me tell you why I'm happy that we've gotten this, but we need to do this. Let me tell you who fought against extending unemployment benefits, who championed giving money directly to Boeing. Like, those are the things that I think are actually valuable and the narrative that we should be putting out, instead of celebrating the bipartisan compromise of a bill that isn't going to do nearly enough for people. Because I think that is what contributes to the disengagement that people feel. When you tell them that this is a great success, and then it doesn't actually improve their lives, they don't believe you anymore, and you've broken their trust. And that is what we've had so much of. Rather than just talking straight to people and saying, you're right, this isn't going to be enough, but I'm trying to get something right now. Here's the reasons why it's not enough. Here's the fights that we had. I think right now there was an example of this is the fact that last week there were headlines. White House is going to use Medicare to pay for coronavirus treatment. So we're giving Donald Trump credit for extending universal health care for coronavirus. And some people were saying, well, the Democrats are really pushing him on that. But that's not the headline that gets out there. So things that happen behind closed doors, people don't get credit for. And I do think that in the media landscape that we have, frankly, getting credit is really important, and being really true about the conversations that happen and transparent about them is incredibly important. And we have to be more honest and transparent with the American people, so that we don't look like we are pulling the wool over their eyes. I'm scrolling. There's so many. Alright. I don't know if I ever trust the chat window here, because I feel like I miss some people. Let's keep scrolling through. See if there's anything I missed. Terry, maybe we can catch up a little more. Terry's got a few more questions that maybe we can talk later. All right, I think I've got them all. I'm sorry if I missed some. I know that there's sometimes in the feed, but it is just about 8:30. So if anybody's got a final question, I'll definitely take them. If anybody's curious about why I have so many books about baseball, we can talk about that. I really thank everybody for taking the time to join. I think that this is I really appreciate these opportunities to talk to everybody and to kind of share the vision that I have for what the world could be. I think we're going to keep doing this, especially while we're cooped up inside. So weekly, I think we're going to try to keep doing Mondays. I think next week it'll be Sunday, and I think we'll be on Instagram. I'll double check that and get that confirmed, but we're going to try different platforms too, because I know not everybody's on Facebook, not everybody's on Instagram or Twitter, so we're going to bounce around. So you can find us in a different place probably every week. William's got one last question here about supporting national standards for school curriculums. I think that is a question that I can't answer in 3 minutes, but I think that what I don't support when it comes to education is the system that we have right now that is incredibly focused on testing rather than teaching. And I think that some of the standards that were put forth in No Child Left Behind and then sort of reinvested in through the Obama administration have been the reasons that we have moved students entirely to being test focused. So while I do that the idea of national standards is not inherently bad, I think we have to be really careful about how we institute that and what we consider success, because I think what has happened is that in certain classrooms where maybe students came in at 20% proficiency and then they left at 60% proficiency, that classroom in a lot of according to a lot of standards looks worse than a classroom who came in at 70% and got to 75%. And I think that's what we have to be really careful about with the structure that we have right now. And we have to make sure that teachers are not hamstrung by those standards. I have seen how individual instruction and the ability to give the attention to a student individually is incredibly important, and it makes a difference for that student. And I think we have to make sure that whatever standards we're enacting allow teachers to do that work, because that's what actually gets a student from failing to passing or from just passing to excelling. And I think sometimes when we put national standards in place and tests in place, we hamstring teachers' abilities to do their job. So I'd be really careful about that. Yeah. All right. So thanks again. I really appreciate it. If you are interested in getting involved with our campaign, we always love more volunteers. We are really focused on phone banking right now. So you can sign up to volunteer by going to jessfordelaware.com/volunteer. Sign up there, and our team will reach out to get you trained on phone banking. It's been great. We've been talking to voters every day. The dialer's open from noon to 8:30, so you can reach out to voters in Delaware and tell them about our campaign, hear from what's important to them, and those conversations have been really awesome. It's the voter contact part of running for office is by far my favorite part. So if it's something you want to get involved with, just go to jessfordelaware.com/volunteer. Thank you for all these awesome questions, and I think hopefully I got them all. If not, we can definitely catch up in messages or wherever else we're around. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye.